It is my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Dr. Denise Gill. Dr. Gill is Assistant Professor of Ethnomusicology and of Islam in the Arts in the Department of Music and the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies at Stanford University, where she also serves as affiliated faculty in the program in Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. An ethnographer of extraordinary sensitivity and a theorist of exceptional insight, Gill has developed a program of research that brings approaches from ethnomusicology and sound studies to bear on the affective dimensions of musical traditions in Turkey and the former Ottoman territories. Her book, Melancholic Modalities, which was published last year by Oxford University Press, combines over 3 years of ethnographic fieldwork with a virtuoso command of Ottoman and Turkish musical, social, and religious history to bring readers into the emotional and spiritual lives of Turkish classical musicians today. Putting affect theory and ideas from Deleuze and Guattari into conversation with a panorama of concepts on the semantic field that she refers to as affect, emotion, sentiment, and feeling, Gill has produced an ethnography whose insights and implications resound far beyond her Turkish case study. The book has already gathered wide attention and will, I am sure, be seen as a key contribution to the ethnomusicology of emotion for years to come. Gill's work has been widely recognized. She's received support from a broad range of prestigious granting agencies and organizations, including the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Musicological Society, and Fulbright, which awarded her not 1, but 2 research fellowships. In addition to her many conference presentations at scholarly organizations such as the Society for Ethnomusicology and the American Anthropological Association, she's given invited talks at universities across North America, Europe, and West Asia, including the University of Minnesota, the College of William and Mary, Selçuk University in Konya, Turkey, and New York University, where she recently delivered a talk in the NYU Distinguished Lecture Series in the Department of Music. Highly active in the Society for Ethnomusicology, she chairs the organization's Diversity Action Committee and served on the SEM Council. As anyone who attended her spectacular performance last night knows, she is an extraordinarily skilled vocalist and performer on the kanun, the Turkish trapezoidal zither, and she's concertized across Turkey, Europe, and the US. The title of her talk this evening is Lament of the 21st Century, Posthumous Orality and the Sounds of Refugee Deathwork in Turkey. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Denise Gill.
How can sound ensure a good death? My inculcation in a dyadic master-apprentice relationship for learning Ottoman, Mevlevi, and Turkish classical musics crafted the early stages of my career arc and included time spent at the graves of my teacher's teacher, Quranic reciters, Islamic calligraphers, poets, and master musicians such as these deceased neyzens or ney players, again, outside of Rumi's mausoleum in Konya. For over a decade, I have personally visited graves and silently recited and also sung to the artists therein. This is a devotional practice naturalized in the individual musician to educate students of a given lineage from whom we have inherited an art and to remind us of the inevitable place where we will all end. Empirically, we know that the last sense to leave the human body before death is hearing. And in Sunni Muslim cemeteries throughout Turkey, we recite because it is believed that there is life in the grave. In the last 2 years, the current administration in Turkey has gone to lengths to educate its citizens in the proper matter of entering Muslim graveyards, sounding out prayerful recitations. When Turks are instructed to engage proper sound labors to venerate Muslim dead, which includes Arabic language as well as Turkish transliteration and Turkish translation of the transliterated meaning, when we see this, we see a disciplining act of state power in the body politic through an individual's sounding practice. We recite because of an implicit knowledge that the deceased can hear us. I have named the belief that the dead can still sense the living and that the deceased can hear during and after death posthumous orality. Posthumous orality, as I define and explore it, takes both an ethnographic and sound studies approach to consider multisensory possibilities of and after death. Posthumous orality is not a belief, but an assumption that the dead can still hear, see, smell. And for more on the general theorization of posthumous orality, please see my piece in Sounding Out, the Sound Studies blog. My conceptual framework of posthumous orality challenges a hard-drawn ontological line we assume and maintain at the end of life. Posthumous orality invites us to listen at a crossroads in which local philosophical structures mediate a constellation of sounding, silences, movement, voicing, and hearing. Developing a theorization of posthumous orality is a necessary intervention in current literatures, because I ask us to attend to multisensory perceptions that extend beyond the gray where, first, we assume life ends, and second, where some of our theories go to die. That was a joke. Posthumous orality is an exercise of theory and of translation. It is a commitment I give to not compressing spectrums of valuation and meaning into normative English, secular, and ableist academies, or academic speak. My first book, Melancholic Modalities, Affect, Islam, and Turkish Classical Musicians, challenges the way we music scholars reify orality, genealogy, and feeling rules that cannot be compressed into our current framework of studying affect, feeling, sentiment, emotion. While the book tracks the domestication of affect by contemporary musicians performing and transmitting Ottoman and Turkish classical music in urban centers, the book is also itself a pedagogy of the traces abandoned in translation. This first book took the use and utility of affect theory in music studies to task, but I find myself overcome attuning to the task of translating death. My talk today is a small portion of a larger project I'm currently thinking about as critical listening and Muslim death work. The ethnography broadly includes interviews with aid workers, analyses of the melodic recitations and vocal aspects of mortuary rituals, sensory ethnographic interrogation of people's engagements with Muslim shrines and pilgrimages, instrumental musics and songs written from the perspective of the dead, and the amalgamation of sound and voice in animal sacrifice. I continue theorizing new approaches to affect, but I now attend to affect not only as an operational form of sociality that regulates what kinds of feelings are meant to be had by musicians, but also through the tactility, smelling, and listening and voicing of people who do a service of working with the dead. It's a project in the affectively laden labor of death work. And an ethnomusicology of death work would follow Donna Haraway's invitation to stay with the trouble. By death work, I mean more than the Sunni and Shia mortuary rituals of washing, praying, reciting over, and shrouding the dead for burial. Muslim death work includes these stations, but requires affective labour and a virtuosic mastery of movement and sound for the aural sensing dead. In an acoustomology of death work, a coming to know death through sound, affective modalities that circulate in the washing house for the dead make particular forms of listening simultaneously possible and impossible. In the project, I am not interested in presenting findings. Rather, what is at stake for me is explaining a way of knowing and a way of living. Delineating a way of knowing means communicating how affect circulates and is constituted as touch, taste, smell, listening, voicing. Today I will only focus on refugee and how refugee death mediates listening in Turkey. Refugee death is a challenging substance for thinking about sound worlding. Because doing death work is a realization of posthumous orality, the refugee dead are, again, believed to be and known to be capable of sense experience. So if the dead are sensory, their sense perception becomes the root of subject formation. Refugee death work is therefore, by default, a reallocation of personhood through the tactility, care labor, and voices of the living. But refugee death work contains archival impetus as much as erasures that teach us about the possibilities of ethnomusicology in what Walter Benjamin called the refuse of history. Death is not mute, but neither does it produce legible or acoustic remains. To attune to death is to listen within the spatial collapse of the human and non-human, the solid and the vibrational, the still and the moving. Death makes audible some of the most pernicious human attempts to explain difficult to grasp sense experiences through allegory and anthropomorphism. I get Haraway's call to stay with the trouble. Doing death with my own tongue, lungs, breath, ears, my upper chest, arms, hands, has created the experiential knowledge that sustains my theorization of death work and allows me to attempt to cultivate what Anna Singh has called the arts of living on a damaged planet. Living as an art and living in the contemporary political topographies of the world brings me not only to the literal post-human refugee body, but also to bodies of water. Seas are neither empty nor vacuous, and continents are not natural facts, but the product of human history and human devising. Thinking of the Aegean Sea, for example, as a boundary between Europe and Asia, or assuming that the Mediterranean is a buffer between Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East, is an ideological slippage that reifies late European colonial categories. Thousands of years ago, the earliest Mesopotamian and ancient Greek texts articulate a world in which seas were not borders. Water in seas were the hub of multi-species sociality. Water made worlds possible. As scholars, we should extinguish the myth of continental difference and decolonize the assumptions generating our frameworks. In disciplinary frames, leakages of our neat separation of terrestrial geographic music areas, for example, demonstrates the dangers of conducting analysis without a focus on the interstices between dirt and rock or ocean sea. So let me briefly dwell on disciplining disciplines. I'm a scholar of Turkey, geography, language, of Ottoman Turkish classical music, another language, too, imperial occupation, imperial nostalgia, archive methodologies, formations of a nation state, and a scholar of affect theory, so a music specialist who reads and speaks back to humanistic and social science inquiries about affect, however named or analyzed. So in the boxes I inhabit, happily, in ethnomusicology, and in the ways we ethnomusicologists inherit our curriculum, in our academic hirings, and in the ways we categorize the wealth of sounds that we carry, ethnomusicologists by default fall back into an orientation in which we produce and sustain knowledge formation based on geography of continents, language, and histories of different iterations of communal consciousness. Our structures of theorizing and analyzing sound objects, musical practices, and literacies of listening become particularly exacerbated with 21st century refugees. But a systemic world of violence, displacement, imperialism, and debility is not new to the 21st century. Our discipline simply refaces an epistemological crisis that's been around since before the founding of our field. Continuing forms of empire, neoliberalism and militarism, the creation of ecological wastelands, and violences enacted on non-human others have obscured our neat objects of analysis. So a gentle theoretical thread unraveling in my mind was in the title of the talk. Perhaps Lament is a generative framework. Perhaps Lament is an epistemological answer to the dissolution of analytic certitudes that the terms genre, tradition, community, region, or country once ostensibly offered us. Mediterranean is an interesting term. It comes from the Latin Mediterraneus, denoting midland. The word carries a connotation of a sea, not land, as the middle, as the center of the earth. Aegean is also an interesting word with a longer genealogy. In one iteration, Aegeus threw himself into his own death in this sea when he believes his son Theseus had been killed. The sea, Aegeus's grave, becomes his namesake. Even in a name, a sea becomes the evidence of transcorporeality in which bodily borders and watery environments are continuous and convulsive. Etymologies of the very words Mediterranean and Aegean tell us intermaterial, intersectional stories of water as the center of the world, as land itself, and as deathly destination. Sometimes the centrality of these seas and the deaths they engender are lost in music studies. Scholars following an area studies approach, engaging music ethnography, tend to focus on specific coastal communities, while music historians have generally studied traditions of societies with relative homogeneity. In cross-cultural studies, we tend to highlight these regions as sites of multicultural immersion, studying histories of commercial exchange and circuits of tourism. Even though the concept music of the Mediterranean is a useful pushback on our reliance on national and linguistic boundaries, I still write against a disciplinary trope of music of the Mediterranean that tends to sanitize this region as producing musics of or expressing shared traditions. Now, alternatively, lament literatures tell stories about how the sounds, movements, foods, textiles, and ceremonies of death rituals are the archive, which structure the repertoires of all life rituals. Lament scholarship proliferated in the 1970s through the early 90s in English, French, German, and Greek. They were ethnographies, generally in anthropology and ethnomusicology, focused on insular communities and literal lamentation sounds and musics in mortuary rituals. But I hear these specific, generally thick description case studies as distinct chapters of a larger story. That story gives us rhizomatic meta-ears and an understanding that producing knowledge under the narrative of shared traditions occurs at a devastating expense of studying sound, listening, and human survival on the seas themselves. I therefore adopt the term lament as an epistemological tool to broaden a theoretical framework that I believe literatures on lament have already enabled. Deploying lament as a theoretical framework allows me a generative alternative to area studies paradigms. My ethnographic encounters with refugee dead escape analytic frames, and thus they risk being systemically unheard. Their deaths demand a conceptualization of my current project as not an ethnomusicology of refugees in Turkey, but rather as an ethnomusicology of the vast, uncalculable oralities of lamentation in the Turkish language Mediterranean Aegean lands and seas. Crafting a 21st century ethnomusicology of lament is an invitation for reorientation. Because the rubric of lament is loud, it amplifies questions about where ethnographies about sounds should be happening. And lament framework projects ontology not as a static philosophical study of being, but as a charged theory of existence in which being refutes easy categorization. Now, the consequences of this intellectual move should be immediately audible to us all. Analyzing lament at the expansive level of the seas in their entirety requires us to both listen for people in flight from a homeland and to people drowning at sea. Thus, in my research with Syrian, Afghani, and Iraqi refugees, I am called to record a twice-wrought violence of simultaneous death and displacement in process in water. As scholars, we must now render the Mediterranean and the Aegean seas akin to Paul Gilroy's theorization of the Black Atlantic and M. Jackie Alexander's work on slave death in The Crossing. This new crossing is dependent on emergent forms of sensing and hearing. Radical listening relations surface as refugees utilize networks of sound technologies in diverse ways. Through my ethnographic encounters, I can trace an alternative trajectory of sound technology happening on these seas in the crossing. Refugees, as you may know, journey with human traffickers, some of whom provide, with money, by payment, extra cell phone batteries for people to have phones on and open in transit overseas, connected to people or families on land. Through the mediation of spotty cell reception, listening and sounding are the call and response of the explosive fear experienced by people crossing seas. Sound and listening are also critical components of finding refugees at sea, living and dead. International shipping vessels and fishermen and women in the Mediterranean and Aegean have developed masterful listening skill sets. Furthermore, sonar and echo sounder technologies have shed their utility as military technology and are refigured as a kind of telephonic body in which refugees can be found and recovered. And based on the size, movement, and coloration of the returning images, seafarers have told me what steps they take to prepare themselves psychologically for the probability of finding the body of a child. Taken together, this evidence requires ethnomusicologists to attend to issues of agency and consent in communities of forced migration. Because after all, a refugee is one in flight from a particular violent state regime through multiple other regimes of non-inclusion. The refugee hopes to travel unheard. Several sovereign states and different military powers are coercive and counterproductive to their travel goals. Should ethnomusicologists even be listening to refugees on the seas? And an accounting for uses of sound technologies on the crossing also requires scholars to refigure the documented history of telephonic communication. My work augments a standard North American-centered theorization of mobile sound technology and amplification. On the sea, telephony is rendered a traumatic listening experience, a tragic new formation of Charles Hirschkin's ethical soundscape or Kay Chalamet's seascape, with an ear leaning into the immediate and utterly bleak sounds of aqueous genocide. The hegemonic extension of the ear brings us to the ethical ramifications of hearing haunting, especially for aid workers, seafarers, and death workers. Haunting is mediation that links immaterial body to sociology to biography. Avery Gordon reminds us that to be haunted is to be tied to historical and social effects. Listening to refugee death is the amplification of what Rob Nixon calls slow violence. If political states and empires, fueled by neoliberalism and war, are sustained by creating imagined communities, think the United States, where I am from, Nixon argues that these same infrastructures actively and mindfully produce unimagined communities in maintaining discourses of national development. So a nation like the US, for example, is made by who doesn't get counted as American. Water and these seas and refugee death work teaches us to listen hard to the somatic long dyings of an unimagined community in a place displaced from the recognizable and audible boundary of any nation states, sounds and bodies out of place. Turkey's Mediterranean and southern Aegean coasts have been long-standing tourist destinations. The musical communities of coastal cities and the employees at all-inclusive seaside resorts have delighted international tourists and locals alike with a spectrum of musics, from Russian pop songs of the 1990s to what I am just going to call cruise ship salsa. In the last 4 years, these Turkish musicians have moved elsewhere to find work, and the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism reports that over 1,000 hotels have closed. And it was near one of these most popular tourist destinations for Turks and for international tourists, Bodrum, that the body of the 3-year-old Alan Kurdi was washed to shore in 2015. And in this poster you see from a Turkish protest about enacting better responses by the government for addressing refugee issues, you can see the top of it. It says, we should be silent when children are sleeping. We should be silent when children are sleeping, not while they are dying. In effect, the Mediterranean of the 21st century is not Nietzsche's so-called South, or a European romantic traveler's dream water, but the graveyard of our times where thousands of refugees perish each year. So thinking about the sea as a grave. While mapping my own cartographies of watery graves, I caught wind of the project by a Turkish NGO called Hayat-ı Destek, or Support to Life. In partnership with the neoliberal marketing firm TBWA in Istanbul, Hayat-ı Destek launched a 1-month art installation in the Mediterranean Sea called Mezar Deniz, or the Sea Cemetery. The NGO hoped to encourage financial contributions through crafting consciousness-raising media art. And I would like to play a short consciousness-raising media art piece that they did. The speakers, in case your ears aren't attuned, are speaking Arabic. They are Syrian refugees. And this short art installation was translated into English, German, French, Italian, and Turkish.
كنت أحلم أني بيوم من الأيام أشوف البحر وأقعد على شواطئه. كرهت البحر وتمنيت أني ضال تحت القصف بسوريا ولا أشوف هالمناظر هاي وأشوف هالبحر.
ابني لو أشوفه شاب مثل الوردة، يعني مستحيل أنساه. الوالحز ابني له قبر وأروح عليه وأشوفه أو هو.
كانوا قرايبين كثير منهم اللي يريد يقطع البحر يعيش بأوروبا، بس صار البحر بالنسبة لنا مقبرة لجميع السوريين.
By the time the installation was erected in May 2016, I had collected documentation that the Turkish state had already taken responsibility for the bodies of over 4,000 refugees who had died in the Aegean and Mediterranean. That was 2016. In my interviews, Hayat-ı Destek leaders explained to me that NGOs working with refugees must not only focus on refugee life, they must labor to ensure honor in refugee death. Yet the choice of sonic and visual representation, from the sampling of sustained tones on strings and sparse piano intervals with brief harmonic resolutions, to the uniform marble-like tombstones bearing names and lifespans, were geared, of course, to Euro-American viewership. The NGO acknowledged their strategy here. They worked to incite Western accountability. And when I asked about the tombstones, they smartly fell back on the claim that not all refugees dying at sea are Muslim. This specific point is lost in the burial of refugees on Turkish land, where all refugees are given Sunni Muslim burials, fully funded by the Turkish state. One of the most significant aspects of my recent fieldwork has been the training and certification I received through the state-run Department of Cemeteries of the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality to conduct Islamic rituals for washing the dead, which include melodic recitations, again, believed to be heard by the deceased. I was trained in a gassale from the Ottoman term gassal, denoting washed, and hane, connoting house. I did most of my death work at Istanbul's Karacaahmet cemetery, alongside brilliant women who do this work as paid state employees and who are also devout Turkish Hanafi Sunni Muslims. And at this cemetery, Karacaahmet, we must remember that Karacaahmet cemetery is the largest and one of the oldest cemeteries in Turkey, and ostensibly is the second largest cemetery in the world. At Karacaahmet, I have washed Sunnis according to Sunni rituals and Alevis according to Shia custom, laying women and girl children of all ages, diseases, and accidents to rest. Death work immerses me in dispersed temporalities where death is neither thingness nor boundary. Our mindful melding of affective labor, physical labor, and sounding are believed to provide the deceased with a beautiful and a good death. Letting water linger, voices ring, the dead listen, we resacralize and rehumanize the deceased through the immaterial transduction of wetness, smell, sound, and the warm touch of the living death worker. Caring for the dead requires my voice, my breath, a kind of guttural grunt, the bone and muscle from shoulder to elbow, and every part of my hand, from the strength of the palm near my wrist to the extension of my fingers and the use of my fingernails. We have tools to extend the impact of our body, like sponges, cotton, bars of soap. We use water to cleanse and to sacralize. We require rose water to allow for a necessary pleasurable reorientation of the deceased's smellscape. Both clean water and rose water are not dried from the body before we shroud. These waters, abdest, wudu, right, maintain purity in the interstitial zone of the dead's resting place. And we are gently tactile because she senses our presence, sounds, and movements. With cotton, we rip pieces of a shroud. We close eyes, we close mouths, and we close all other orifices of the body, but we never place anything in an ear. Posthumous orality means that she must be allowed to continue to hear. So most of the times when we wash the dead, the room is packed with mourners. One of our jobs as washers is to mediate the sonic elements of suffering. We kindly educate relatives to refrain from loud sounds of grief. So with soft voices, direct eye contact, and empathetic touch to a living, grieving elbow or hand, we are virtuosic choreographers of loss for the living. We strike the balance, raising our voices of pleasant recitations if there is wailing. We maintain comfort for the deceased by using hot water on the surfaces of her skin, which work against the cold liquids we massage out of her body. And I personally have never begun shrouding before her body warms. But directing the crowded loudness of mourners pales in comparison to being alone in a room with a deceased refugee. This is death as unmournable death, an empty room, a death that cannot be socially recognized in full because they are deaths that do not count. Or so I thought when I first began this apprenticeship. With refugee death, we enter an alternative mode of death work in which we act as both washer and mourner. By my teachers and colleagues, I was invited to perform a kind of filio pseudo-lament, to grieve the refugee on our table as though she is our own relative whose loss we feel press immediately on our own bodily boundaries. When we lift and place the deceased refugee on our table, I was taught to linger. I was permitted to do something we never do in death work. I was allowed, supported, to silently weep. In the return to linguistic capacity, we speak with the dead refugee in Turkish, first choosing to call her aunt, sister, or daughter based on her age. She is a posthumously oral person. Our words form an intimate bond. And remember, I weep quietly because we do not want her to experience sadness. If crying were made audible, we would not do justice to our work. We labor to provide her peace. To her ears with our vocal recitations, to her nose with the generous use of rose water, and with the gentle cleansing and then ritual washing of her entire body, from the canals behind her ears to the dirt under her toenails. And in refugee death work, we begin this relationship by saying, in Turkish, sister, I do not know if you are Christian, Shia, Hanafi. I do not know the name your mother gave you. I will give you everything I know how to give. Help me by accepting my gift. May God forgive me of my ignorance and welcome you into paradise. We switch from Turkish to Arabic, and with large sponges of soap and a shower head, we massage out bodily waste, repeatedly reciting, Ufraneke ya Rahman, forgiveness, O merciful one. We double and triple check that the water we use is hot, and we recite, Ufraneke ya Rahman, and in Turkish we ask about her journey while covering her calluses and her wounds with cotton. We talk in Turkish as if she could respond because we know she's trying to respond. She hears. She is the one with posthumous orality. We are the living, but we are deaf, incapacitated to access her sensorial world. So we regularly wipe her eyes with gauze as if she had tears. This is not rehumanization for death workers. It is simply a human service for a humanized other. And all the while we are reciting. After washing and smelling the cleanliness of her head, putting our nose up close, we rub rose water into her hair and sprinkle rose water on the tunic, the first layer we rip for her from the shroud, and fill the room with these beautiful aromas as much as beautiful sounds. We explained to her that the Department of Cemeteries Bureau Archive has recorded all the details of her autopsy and filed her DNA in Turkey's mass database for displaced persons who die in Turkish lands and seas. We assure her she will be found by family. And before ripping fabric to form the other layers of her shroud, we recite a specific prayer. This melodic, song-like recitation is one iteration of the tekbir. And this particular melodic tekbir is done by Sunni Muslims here in Canada, in Tanzania, in Burma, in Saudi Arabia, and in Silicon Valley. What has been forgotten by Sunni Muslims, even by nearly all practicing Muslims in Turkey, is that this setting of the tekbir was composed by the celebrated 17th century Ottoman musician Buhurizade Mustafa Itri. Itri's 6-note composition in Segyah Makama, or the melodic mode Segyah, was a jewel of the Ottoman court. The Arabic text for the tekbir, announcing God's oneness and greatness, set in Itri's musical lines, is the last layer of our voice we deliberately place in the ear of our refugee dead. And we recite it directly into her ear, as if sharing a secret while gently caressing the top of her head. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allah, ilhamd. And when closing the kefen shroud, we tell her we are honored to be her family in this moment. And when tying the knots on the shroud, we continue to verbalize prayers to the refugee, knowing that her soul hears us. This immaterial yet physical wet, sensorial, spiritual, sonic, and virtuosic affective labor is the performance and the cyclical validation of posthumous orality in action. We are currently thriving in a political moment when other human lives are expendable, requiring us to urgently craft speculative ethics. Doing death work has immersed me in listening structures past my conceptual and intellectual frameworks. Reciting to the dead grounds sound and voice in the materiality of living and non-living bodies, and listening to where the human breaks puts us in an ocean of undoing. Death is a mediator of contamination and sacralization. It exposes our vulnerability in a precarious world not of our own making. Crafting a lament-based theory for an ethnomusicology of death work minimally requires sensory ethnography, acoustomology, deep history, eco-criticism, and a kind of post-humanism that does not evacuate politics, tuning into the constitutive nexus of militarism, capitalism, and neoliberalism. Contingencies of the Anthropocene is at the foundation of this work, because these contingencies are what made these seas cemeteries. And so, refugee death makes for desolate punctuation. Ethnomusicologists are and will continue investing in the auditory consequences of military-industrial complexes that cause pain and damage to humans globally. The Mediterranean, the Aegean, and most recently, in the last year, the Black Sea crossings are perpetuated when we naturalize the violence that creates crossings, even if that normalization is as simple as parsing musical practices to territories or states without addressing cuts and ruptures. Sounding out and against the structures that create and sustain the very category refugee is one way ethnomusicologists can manifest an ethics of sharing based in our unsurpassable strengths as scholars of sound, event, and attunement. An ethnomusicology of death work that questions oralities of crossings is an opportunity to become better listeners and thus better intellectuals. Amplifying a theoretical frame of lament in our field exposes that to which humanity can cover its ears, even when it may be as clamorous as a sea cemetery or as quiet as singing refugee souls, singing souls into their grave. Now, it is critical to celebrate what divides me, the privileged intellectual with time to devote to theory and thinking, and my intersecting material and capital forms of privilege that remove me from thousands of individuals, families, and entire communities for whom this crossing never ends. Yet I find it also useful to celebrate what unites us, the knowledge that the only certitude of life is death. I delve into this work, which is not of death, but of what living can look like when I make death my friend. Death work teaches me how sounds, smells, tastes, and feelings are possible when we refute an assumption that death is an end. An ethnomusicology of death work is a study of listening and affective labor at all points of a threshold, itself yet another kind of crossing. Death work is a craft that requires a skill set. In death, that which we consider private, our nakedness, all parts of our skin, our bodily liquids, these things are made public. The craft of Sunni Muslim death work in Turkey is about extending that privacy and that individual life, respecting the dignity of the naked body by maintaining a covering at all times, acting accordingly to the knowledge that the dead are watching, smelling, listening, as if they were behind our backs. Death work is about allowing the traces of multiple lives to live on through our hands, ears, and voices. Death work is also an aesthetic practice of critical kindness and sonic generosity. And I'm grateful to you this evening for hearing my ideas about the epistemological consequences of refugee death work. You became witnesses to the 27 refugee women, infants, and girls whose names I could not sing because we did not know them. But my body and my ears bear the last of their senses, and now they are in your ears. Listening makes their death count. Thank you.